Vivian Anderson was once the embodiment of elegance and power, her life a seamless blend of luxury and influence. She was admired, envied, and respected by many, her every move a statement of sophistication. But all of that changed on a rainy evening when her car skidded off the road in a devastating accident. The impact was brutal, leaving her in a coma, her body broken, and her mind seemingly lost in a deep, unreachable place. As she lay unconscious in the hospital, her once vibrant existence was reduced to a mere shadow of its former self. Her future, once so certain, now hung in the balance, teetering on the edge of oblivion. Jonathan Anderson, her husband, was the picture of grief as he stood by her bedside, holding her limp hand with feigned sorrow. But beneath the surface of his tear-streaked face, a different story was unfolding. Jonathan had long been resentful of Vivian's success, feeling overshadowed and insignificant in comparison. The accident, while tragic, presented him with an opportunity he had never dared to dream of. With Vivian incapacitated, he could finally step out of her shadow and seize the life he believed he deserved. His heart hardened. Jonathan began to see his wife's misfortune as a stroke of fate, a chance to take control. With cold calculation, Jonathan wasted no time in executing his plan. He moved swiftly, ensuring that Vivian's condition remained a closely guarded secret. Under the guise of protecting her privacy, he had her transferred to a remote island estate, far from the prying eyes of the public and the media. The island, surrounded by treacherous waters and thick forests, was the perfect place to hide her away. Jonathan arranged for a small medical team to accompany her, their silence bought with generous payments. To the outside world, Vivian had simply disappeared, her fate unknown, her name slowly fading from memory. Rebecca Carter, Jonathan's lover, was eager to assist in the deceit. Ambitious and cunning, she had always envied Vivian's life and was more than willing to help Jonathan secure it for themselves. Together, they crafted a narrative of devoted care and concern, all while plotting to take over Vivian's vast fortune. As they visited the island under the pretense of checking on her condition, they were instead ensuring that everything was in place for Vivian's quiet disappearance from society. Rebecca reveled in the power she now held, her dreams of wealth and status finally within reach. The island became Vivian's prison, a place of isolation where time seemed to stand still. Her days were spent in a fog of unconsciousness, her body unresponsive, her mind trapped in darkness. The medical team, indifferent to her suffering, performed their duties mechanically, more concerned with their paychecks than her recovery. Vivian was aware of nothing but the oppressive silence, the distant sound of waves crashing against the shore, and the cold, clinical touch of strangers. It was a nightmare from which she could not awaken, a limbo that stripped her of her dignity and her voice. Jonathan and Rebecca, meanwhile, continued their lives as if nothing had happened. They attended parties, made business deals, and slowly began to integrate themselves into the life that had once been Vivian's. The world believed their story of a loving husband caring for his ailing wife, never suspecting the treachery that lay beneath. As the months passed, Jonathan's confidence grew. He felt invincible, certain that he had outmaneuvered everyone, including fate itself. With Vivian out of the picture, he and Rebecca could finally live the life they had always dreamed of, free from the constraints of her presence. But beneath the surface of their apparent success, a seed of doubt began to take root. Jonathan, despite his outward bravado, could not completely silence the nagging voice in the back of his mind. At night, when the world was quiet and the weight of his actions pressed down on him, he would find himself questioning whether his plan had truly succeeded. The memory of Vivian's lifeless form haunted him, a ghost that refused to be laid to rest. Rebecca, too, began to sense the fragility of their victory, though she dismissed her fears with the same determination that had driven her to betrayal. On the island, Vivian's body remained still, but her mind was not as lost as they believed. Though her consciousness was buried deep, it was not extinguished. There were moments, fleeting but growing in strength, where a spark of awareness flickered within her. She could not move or speak, but somewhere in the depths of her mind, she was fighting. The betrayal, the pain, the loss of her freedom, it all began to fuel a slow, burning resolve. The woman they had sought to destroy was not gone. She was merely waiting, gathering her strength for the moment when she could reclaim her life. As the days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months, the world forgot Vivian Anderson. Her name was no longer spoken in the halls of power. Her presence no longer missed at the social events where she had once been a star. Jonathan and Rebecca continued their charade, their lives seemingly perfect, but they could not escape the shadow of their betrayal. And far away, on that lonely island, Vivian's spirit stirred, the spark of her will to live growing stronger with each passing day. The battle for her life had only just begun, and when the time came, she would rise, not as the woman they remembered, but as someone entirely new, someone determined to take back everything that had been stolen from her. The island where Vivian was exiled was a place of eerie beauty, isolated and untouched by the world. Dense forests surrounded the small estate, with the sea's relentless waves crashing against jagged cliffs below. The house itself, a cold and imposing structure, stood as a silent sentinel over the landscape, its walls concealing the tragedy unfolding within. Inside, Vivian was confined to a sterile room, her world reduced to the four walls that kept her hidden from view. The only sounds were the faint hum of medical machines and the distant cry of seabirds, a constant reminder of her isolation. The small medical team assigned to care for Vivian was handpicked by Jonathan, chosen for their discretion rather than their dedication. They moved through their routines with detached efficiency, their concern for Vivian's well-being overshadowed by their desire to keep their lucrative positions. Days turned into weeks as they administered the bare minimum of care, their conversations about her reduced to clinical terms devoid of empathy. To them, she was merely a job, a task to be completed before they could return to their own lives, far removed from the island's solitude. Vivian's existence in this isolated prison was one of profound loneliness. Though her body was still and unresponsive, her mind was beginning to stir in the darkness. She was aware of the passage of time, the monotony of the days blending together in a haze of confusion and despair. Trapped in her own body, she could feel the world moving around her, yet she remained powerless to interact with it. The betrayal by Jonathan and Rebecca weighed heavily on her subconscious, a dark cloud that hovered just beyond her reach, taunting her with its presence. As the weeks dragged on, Jonathan and Rebecca grew more confident in their deceit, believing that Vivian was as good as dead. They visited the island occasionally, more to satisfy their curiosity than out of genuine concern. Each time they left, the staff would gossip in hushed tones, speculating on how long their wealthy employer would remain in her comatose state. They never noticed the small signs of change in Vivian's condition, the slight flicker of her eyelids, or the faint twitch of her fingers. These moments of movement were so subtle that they went unnoticed, but for Vivian, they were monumental. Vivian's mind, though trapped, was beginning to claw its way back to awareness. In the quiet of the night, when the staff had retreated to their quarters and the house was shrouded in darkness, she would focus all her energy on trying to move. The effort was exhausting, but the small victories, an involuntary twitch, a faint sensation in her limbs, were enough to fuel her determination. She knew that she was still alive, still capable of thought and feeling, even if her body refused to cooperate. This growing awareness brought with it a renewed sense of hope, a fragile thread that she clung to in the overwhelming darkness. The island's isolation, once a source of despair, began to take on a different meaning for Vivian. It was a place where she could gather her strength, away from the prying eyes of the world and the manipulations of those who had betrayed her. She imagined herself walking through the dense forests, feeling the earth beneath her feet, the wind in her hair. These thoughts, though distant and dreamlike, gave her something to hold on to, a vision of freedom that kept her spirit alive. The island, once her prison, was slowly becoming her sanctuary, a place where she could begin to rebuild herself, piece by piece. Jonathan and Rebecca, unaware of the changes taking place within Vivian, continued to build their lives on the foundation of lies they had constructed. They enjoyed the fruits of their deceit, basking in the luxury and power that Vivian's wealth afforded them. But even as they celebrated their success, a part of Jonathan remained uneasy. There were moments when he would find himself staring out at the sea, wondering if Vivian could somehow sense the life they were living without her. These thoughts were fleeting, quickly dismissed, but they hinted at a deeper fear that he could not completely shake. As the days on the island passed, the staff grew complacent, their vigilance waning as they settled into their routines. They had come to believe that Vivian would never recover, that she was destined to remain a silent, motionless figure in the sterile room. This complacency worked to Vivian's advantage, giving her the time and space to continue her struggle. She could sense the change in their attitudes, the way they no longer watched her as closely, the way their hands moved more carelessly during their checks. It was a small victory, but it was enough to give her hope that, one day, she might be able to break free. Vivian's struggle to regain control of her body was a lonely battle, fought in the silence of the night and the solitude of her thoughts. Each small movement, each flicker of awareness, was a triumph that spurred her on. She knew that she was still far from regaining her full strength, but she refused to give up. The thought of confronting Jonathan and Rebecca, of reclaiming her life and her dignity, became the beacon that guided her through the darkest moments. She was no longer just a victim of their betrayal. She was a survivor, fighting to rise from the ashes of the life they had tried to destroy. And so, on that desolate island, surrounded by the indifferent sea and the watchful trees, Vivian Anderson began the slow, painful process of her rebirth. She was still a prisoner in her own body, but her mind was awakening, her spirit refusing to be broken. The world outside had forgotten her, but she had not forgotten the world. With each passing day, her resolve grew stronger, her determination fiercer. She would find a way to escape, to return to the life that had been stolen from her. And when she did, she would make sure that those who had betrayed her would pay dearly for their sins. It was a night like any other on the island, silent, still, with only the distant sound of waves crashing against the shore. Inside her room, Vivian lay motionless, her body a prisoner of its own making. But deep within her, something had begun to stir. In the midst of a vivid dream where she was running freely through the island's dense forest, her limbs moving with a grace she hadn't felt in months, Vivian suddenly jolted awake. The sensation was startling, a shock of awareness that left her breathless. She could feel a faint tingling in her fingers, a sensation she hadn't experienced since the accident. It was as if her body was trying to communicate, to tell her that it wasn't entirely lost. At first, Vivian thought she was imagining it, that her mind was playing cruel tricks on her. But the feeling persisted, growing stronger with each passing moment. She focused all her willpower on moving just one finger, and to her astonishment, it responded. The movement was slight, barely perceptible, but it was real. For the first time since the accident, Vivian felt a surge of hope. She wasn't completely paralyzed. There was still a part of her that could fight back. That small flicker of movement ignited something deep within her, a fierce determination to reclaim her body, to escape the prison she had been forced into. Over the next few days, Vivian dedicated every ounce of her energy to regaining control of her body. It was an excruciating process, each movement requiring immense concentration and effort. But with each small success, a twitch of a finger, a slight bend of a wrist, her confidence grew. She realized that her body, though weakened, was still capable of responding to her commands. It was as if she was awakening from a long, dark sleep, her senses slowly coming back to life. The progress was slow, almost imperceptible to the untrained eye, but to Vivian, it was monumental. She was beginning to believe that she could truly recover. The medical staff, oblivious to the changes happening within Vivian, continued their routines with the same detached indifference. They failed to notice the small movements, the slight shifts in her posture. To them, she was still the unresponsive patient they had been caring for all along. This worked to Vivian's advantage, allowing her to continue her secret struggle without interference. She practiced moving her fingers, then her hands, and eventually she was able to turn her head slightly. Each new movement was a victory, a sign that her body was slowly but surely waking up. And with each victory, her resolve to escape grew stronger. Vivian's mind, once clouded and confused, was becoming sharper, more focused. She began to listen intently to the conversations of the staff, piecing together the information she needed to formulate a plan. She learned their routines, their habits, and most importantly, their weaknesses. The more she observed, the more confident she became that she could outsmart them. Her thoughts turned to Jonathan and Rebecca, the people who had betrayed her and left her to die on this isolated island. She knew that if she was going to survive, she needed to get off the island and confront them. But first, she had to regain her strength. The days turned into weeks, and Vivian's progress continued at a slow but steady pace. She could now move her arms with more ease, and even attempted to sit up, though the effort left her exhausted. The medical staff remained oblivious, their lack of attention allowing Vivian to push herself further each day. She kept her movements hidden, only practicing when she was sure she wouldn't be seen. The fear of being discovered kept her cautious, but it also fueled her determination. She knew that if they realized she was regaining control, they might take drastic measures to keep her from escaping. She couldn't afford to be careless. Vivian's dreams became a source of strength, vivid visions of running through the forest, swimming in the ocean, feeling the wind in her hair. These dreams reminded her of what she was fighting for, her freedom, her life. They were a stark contrast to the reality of her situation, but they kept her spirit alive. Each time she woke from one of these dreams, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. She would not let Jonathan and Rebecca win. She would not allow them to strip her of her dignity, her identity. She was more than just a body lying in a bed. She was a fighter, and she was going to find a way out. As her strength slowly returned, Vivian began to think about the logistics of her escape. She knew she couldn't simply walk out the front door. The island was isolated, and there were too many risks. But she also knew that she couldn't stay in that room forever. She needed to explore the house, to find out if there were any means of communication or transportation that she could use. The thought of leaving the safety of her room was terrifying, but it was a risk she had to take. If she wanted to survive, she needed to start taking control of her own fate. One night, when the house was silent and the staff were asleep, Vivian decided to test her limits. She slowly sat up in bed, her muscles protesting but obeying her command. With great effort, she swung her legs over the side of the bed and stood up, her legs trembling beneath her. The pain was intense, but she gritted her teeth and took a step, and then another. The sensation of walking, something she had once taken for granted, was overwhelming. She felt like a newborn foal, unsteady on her legs but determined to move forward. She knew she couldn't push herself too hard, but this small act of defiance was a turning point. She was no longer just surviving. She was fighting back. Vivian returned to bed, her body aching from the effort, but her mind was alive with possibilities. She had proven to herself that she could do it, that she could stand and walk. It was a small step, but it was the beginning of her journey to freedom. She knew that there were still many challenges ahead, but for the first time in months, she felt truly alive. The island was no longer just a place of exile. It was the proving ground where she would reclaim her life. And when the time came, she would be ready to face those who had betrayed her. Jonathan and Rebecca thought they had won, but they were about to learn that Vivian Anderson was not so easily defeated. Vivian's newfound mobility was a double-edged sword. While it gave her hope, it also exposed her to the harsh reality of her situation. Every step she took was a painful reminder of how far she had fallen. The physical effort required to move was immense, each muscle protesting with every slight movement. Yet, the pain was a welcome sensation. It meant she was alive, that her body was still capable of feeling. But it was also a constant reminder of the betrayal she had suffered, the trust she had placed in the wrong people. With each step, Vivian's anger grew, fueling her determination to survive. Exploring the house became Vivian's new daily challenge. She moved cautiously, her heart pounding with fear of being discovered. The house was a maze of cold, sterile rooms, each one more oppressive than the last. The medical staff moved through the corridors with an indifference that both angered and terrified her. They were the gatekeepers of her prison, oblivious to the fact that their patient was slowly regaining control. Vivian studied them, noting their routines, their weaknesses, and most importantly, the times when they were least likely to notice her. Each observation became a piece of the puzzle she was slowly putting together, a plan to escape. As Vivian explored, memories of her life before the accident began to resurface. She thought of the person she had been, confident, powerful, and in control. She had taken her strength for granted, never imagining that it could be stripped away so easily. The realization that she had been so blind, so trusting, filled her with a deep sense of regret. She had allowed Jonathan and Rebecca to deceive her, to use her for their own gain. But that time was over. Each painful step was a step toward reclaiming her life, toward proving that she was not the weak, helpless victim they believed her to be. The isolation of the island became both her ally and her enemy. On one hand, it meant that there were fewer people to notice her growing strength. But on the other hand, it also meant that there was no one to help her if she failed. The fear of what might happen if she were caught was a constant companion. But fear was not enough to stop her. She had come too far, endured too much, to give up now. The island, once a place of despair, was now the proving ground where she would fight for her survival. And she was determined to win, no matter the cost. Vivian's struggle was not just physical. It was emotional and mental as well. Each day brought new challenges, new doubts. There were moments when she questioned whether it was worth it, whether she should simply give in and accept her fate. But those moments were fleeting, quickly replaced by a fierce determination. She would not let Jonathan and Rebecca win. She would not allow them to strip her of her dignity, her identity. Vivian was more than just a body lying in a bed. She was a fighter, and she was going to find a way out of this nightmare. Her nights were the hardest, alone in the darkness, with only her thoughts for company. The weight of her situation would press down on her. The silence was deafening, filled with the echoes of her own doubts and fears. But even in those darkest moments, there was a spark of hope that refused to be extinguished. She would lie awake, imagining the day when she would confront Jonathan and Rebecca, when she would reclaim her life. These thoughts kept her going, fueling her resolve to survive. The island might be her prison, but it was also the place where she would rise again. The physical toll of her efforts was immense. Her body, weakened by months of inactivity, struggled to keep up with her demands. There were days when she could barely move, her muscles aching from the strain. But she refused to let this stop her. Each setback was met with renewed determination. She pushed herself harder, knowing that every small victory brought her one step closer to freedom. The pain, the exhaustion, the fear, they were all part of the process, part of her journey to reclaim what had been taken from her. As Vivian's strength grew, so did her resolve. She began to see the island not just as a prison, but as a place of transformation. It was here that she was being reborn, forged anew in the fires of her struggle. The woman who had arrived on the island was not the same woman who was slowly emerging. This new Vivian was stronger, more determined, and ready to fight for her life. She was no longer just surviving. She was preparing for the day when she would confront those who had betrayed her. And when that day came, she would be ready. The struggle for survival had transformed Vivian in ways she had never imagined. The person she had been was gone, replaced by someone stronger, more resilient. The pain, the fear, the isolation, they had all become tools in her arsenal, weapons she would use to reclaim her life. She knew that the road ahead was still long and fraught with danger, but she was ready to face it. The island had been her prison, but it was also the place where she had found herself again. And now, armed with her newfound strength, she was ready to take back what was rightfully hers. With her strength nearly restored, Vivian knew that the time had come to put her escape plan into action. The stakes were incredibly high. If she was caught, there was no telling what Jonathan and Rebecca would do to ensure she remained silent forever. But the thought of spending another day on the island, trapped and powerless, was more terrifying than the risk of failure. Vivian had been patient, carefully observing the routines of the medical staff, the delivery schedules, and the layout of the house. Now, all that planning and preparation would be put to the ultimate test. Vivian knew she had to be meticulous in her execution. The medical team had grown complacent, their attention to detail waning as they assumed she would never recover. This complacency was her greatest advantage. She had noted the exact times when they were most distracted, during their meals, shift changes, and the occasional phone call home. It was in these moments that she could move about more freely, practicing her strength and exploring her options. She had also identified a small storage room at the back of the house, which, to her surprise, held a small inflatable lifeboat. It wasn't much, but it was her ticket off the island. The first step in her plan was to gather supplies. Vivian knew she couldn't simply flee without preparation. She would need food, water, and something to protect herself from the elements. She began to collect small items, taking them from the kitchen and storing them in the storage room with the lifeboat. A few cans of food, a bottle of water, and a thick blanket were hidden away, piece by piece. Each item was small enough to go unnoticed, but together they would be essential for her survival once she left the island. Every trip to the storage room was filled with tension, the fear of being caught making her heart race. Vivian also had to account for the timing of her escape. The island was surrounded by treacherous waters, and the weather could change in an instant. She knew that leaving during a storm would be dangerous, but it would also provide cover, reducing the chances of the medical staff noticing her absence until it was too late. She listened to their conversations, waiting for the forecast of a particularly bad storm. When she finally heard them discussing an incoming tempest, she knew the time had come. The storm was expected to isolate the island for at least a day, cutting off communication and making it difficult for anyone to reach her even if they realized she was gone. The night of the storm, Vivian was ready. She had practiced inflating the lifeboat, making sure she could do it quickly and quietly. She had packed the supplies she had gathered and dressed in layers of clothing to protect herself from the cold. The house was eerily quiet, the wind howling outside as the storm approached. Vivian's heart pounded in her chest, but she forced herself to stay calm. This was her only chance. She waited until she heard the first cracks of thunder, the signal that the storm was fully upon them, before making her move. Vivian slipped out of her room and made her way to the storage room. Her hands shook as she inflated the lifeboat, the sound of the pump masked by the roaring wind. She placed her supplies inside and then, with a strength she didn't know she possessed, dragged the lifeboat to the back door. The rain was coming down in sheets, the wind nearly knocking her off her feet, but she pushed forward, determined to reach the shoreline. The sea was a maelstrom of angry waves, but Vivian didn't hesitate. She pushed the lifeboat into the water and climbed inside, her heart pounding with a mix of fear and exhilaration. The moment the lifeboat hit the water, Vivian was thrown into a battle for survival. The waves were relentless, tossing the small boat around like a toy. But Vivian held on, using the oars to steer herself away from the island. The rain lashed at her face, the cold biting into her skin, but she refused to give up. She had come too far to fail now. Hours seemed to pass as she fought against the storm, her muscles screaming in protest, her mind focused solely on one goal: reaching the mainland. The island slowly disappeared behind her, swallowed by the storm, and with it, the life she had been forced to endure. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the storm began to calm. The waves, though still rough, were no longer as violent, and the sky was starting to lighten with the first hints of dawn. Vivian was exhausted, every part of her body aching, but she kept rowing. She could see the faint outline of land on the horizon, and it filled her with renewed hope. She had done it. She had escaped the island. But her journey was far from over. She still had to reach the shore, and once there, find help. But for the first time in months, she felt a glimmer of freedom, a sense that she was finally in control of her own destiny. As the lifeboat drifted closer to the shore, Vivian allowed herself a moment to reflect. The woman who had arrived on the island was gone, replaced by someone stronger, more determined. She had faced her worst fears, survived against all odds, and now she was free. But she knew that her fight was not over. Jonathan and Rebecca were still out there, living the life they had stolen from her. And she would not rest until she had confronted them, until she had taken back everything they had tried to take from her. The storm had passed, but the real battle was just beginning. As the sun began to rise, Vivian's lifeboat finally reached the shore. The waves, now calmer, gently nudged the small craft onto the sandy beach. Exhausted, soaked to the bone, and shivering from the cold, Vivian collapsed onto the sand, her body trembling with relief. She had made it. The island, her prison for so many months, was now just a distant memory, hidden behind a veil of mist and sea. For a moment, she lay there, letting the warmth of the morning sun touch her face, savoring the sensation of freedom. But she knew her journey was far from over. She still had a score to settle. Vivian was soon discovered by a local fisherman, an older man with a kind face and a weathered demeanor. He found her lying on the beach, barely conscious, and quickly rushed to her aid. Without hesitation, he wrapped her in a blanket and helped her to his small cottage, where he offered her warm soup and dry clothes. The fisherman, whose name was Jack, listened quietly as Vivian, still weak, explained her situation in halting words. He didn't ask many questions, sensing that this woman had been through an unimaginable ordeal. Instead, he offered her the one thing she needed most, his help. Vivian knew she couldn't waste any time. She needed to return to the city, to confront Jonathan and Rebecca before they realized she had escaped. With Jack's assistance, she managed to contact a trusted lawyer who had been a close friend before the accident. He was shocked to hear her voice, having believed, like everyone else, that she was either dead or lost forever. But once he overcame his disbelief, he quickly moved into action. Arrangements were made for her to be flown back to the city in secret, away from the prying eyes of the media and those who might try to stop her. Vivian was determined to return on her own terms, with a plan in place. The journey back to the city was a blur of emotions for Vivian. She felt a mixture of fear, anger, and a fierce determination. She thought about Jonathan and Rebecca, the people who had betrayed her so completely. But she also thought about the life she had left behind, the power, the influence, and the respect she had once commanded. She knew that this confrontation would not just be about revenge. It would be about reclaiming her identity, her dignity, and her place in the world. As the plane descended toward the city, Vivian steeled herself for the battle that lay ahead. She was no longer the woman who had been betrayed. She was a survivor, ready to take back what was hers. Upon arriving in the city, Vivian didn't go directly to her former home. Instead, she went to her lawyer's office, where they reviewed the evidence they had gathered against Jonathan and Rebecca. The betrayal ran deeper than she had initially realized. Jonathan had not only stolen her wealth, but had also begun to dismantle the empire she had built, selling off assets and forging documents to transfer ownership to himself and Rebecca. The depth of their deceit filled Vivian with a cold, burning anger. But anger alone would not be enough. She needed to be strategic, to outmaneuver them in the same way they had tried to outmaneuver her. Vivian's return was carefully orchestrated. Her lawyer contacted the authorities, presenting the evidence of the crimes committed against her. Arrest warrants were quietly issued for Jonathan and Rebecca, but Vivian wanted to be there when they were served. She needed to see the look on their faces to witness their downfall firsthand. She had been powerless for so long, trapped in a body that refused to obey her will. Now, she was taking back that power, and nothing would stop her from confronting them. The day of reckoning had arrived, and Vivian was ready. The confrontation took place in the very home that Jonathan and Rebecca had stolen from her. They were in the middle of a lavish breakfast, enjoying the luxuries that they had taken from Vivian, when the doorbell rang. Expecting nothing more than a delivery or a visitor, they were unprepared for the sight that greeted them. Vivian, standing in the doorway, alive and very much in control. The color drained from their faces as they stared at her in shock, unable to comprehend how she could possibly be there. For a moment, time seemed to stand still, the only sound the ticking of a nearby clock. Vivian stepped inside, her gaze never leaving theirs. The room was filled with a tense silence as she slowly walked toward them. Jonathan tried to speak, to offer some weak explanation, but Vivian silenced him with a single, cold look. She wasn't here for explanations. She was here for justice. As she stood before them, she felt a calmness wash over her, a clarity that had eluded her for so long. She had imagined this moment countless times, but now that it was here, she knew exactly what to do. She didn't need to raise her voice or make dramatic gestures. Her presence alone was enough to convey the gravity of their situation. The authorities arrived moments later, their entrance swift and decisive. Jonathan and Rebecca were handcuffed, their faces a mask of disbelief and fear. They tried to protest, to plead their case, but it was too late. The evidence against them was overwhelming, and there was no escape. As they were led away, Vivian watched them go, feeling a sense of closure that she had not expected. This wasn't just about revenge. It was about reclaiming her life, her identity, and her future. The nightmare was over, but the journey that lay ahead was just beginning. Vivian knew that she had a long road to recovery, but she also knew that she was finally free. Vivian stood in the quiet aftermath of the confrontation, her heart pounding with a mix of adrenaline and relief. The house, once filled with the echoes of betrayal, now felt strangely empty. Jonathan and Rebecca were gone, their schemes unraveled, their powers stripped away. Vivian had watched as they were taken into custody, their desperate pleas falling on deaf ears. Justice had been served, but the victory felt bittersweet. She had regained her freedom, her wealth, and her dignity, but the scars of their betrayal would remain with her forever. As she stood alone in the grand foyer, she realized that the battle had taken more from her than she had anticipated. The legal process that followed was swift and merciless. Jonathan and Rebecca were charged with a litany of crimes, from fraud to attempted murder, their every action dissected and exposed in court. The evidence was overwhelming, and the public, once enamored with their charm and wealth, quickly turned against them. The media feasted on the scandal, turning the trial into a spectacle that captivated the nation. Vivian attended every session, her presence a silent testament to their guilt. She watched as they squirmed under the weight of their lies, their confidence crumbling as the truth came to light. It was a public shaming, a fall from grace that they had never imagined. But while the court proceedings brought a sense of closure, they also forced Vivian to confront the full extent of what she had lost. The life she had built, the empire she had created, had been tainted by their treachery. Every asset they had touched felt contaminated, a reminder of their betrayal. Vivian's lawyer worked tirelessly to recover what was rightfully hers, but she found little solace in the victory. The wealth, the properties, the businesses, they were all symbols of a life that no longer existed. Vivian realized that reclaiming her material possessions would not heal the wounds that had been inflicted on her soul. In the weeks following the trial, Vivian withdrew from the public eye. She sold the mansion where the betrayal had taken place, unable to bear the memories it held. She liquidated several of her assets, distancing herself from the life she had once cherished. Instead, she turned her attention inward, seeking a way to rebuild herself from the ground up. The woman who had been betrayed was gone, replaced by someone stronger, someone who had been forged in the crucible of adversity. Vivian knew that she could never return to the person she had been, but she could choose who she would become. Vivian's transformation was not just about leaving behind the material trappings of her old life. It was about finding a new purpose. She began to reach out to others who had suffered similar betrayals, using her resources to support those who had been wronged. She funded legal aid for victims of fraud and abuse, offering them a chance to fight back against those who had wronged them. Vivian found a sense of fulfillment in this work, a way to channel her pain into something positive. It was a form of justice, not just for herself, but for all those who had been silenced, marginalized, and forgotten. As the months passed, Vivian's reputation began to shift. No longer was she seen as the glamorous socialite who had once dominated the headlines. Instead, she became known as a fierce advocate for justice, a woman who had risen from the ashes of her former life to become a force for good. The media, always eager for a redemption story, began to tell a new narrative, one of strength, resilience, and transformation. Vivian embraced this new identity, finding peace in the knowledge that her suffering had not been in vain. She had turned her pain into power, her loss into gain. But even as she found new meaning in her life, there was a part of Vivian that could not forget the past. The scars of Jonathan and Rebecca's betrayal ran deep, and there were nights when the memories would return unbidden to haunt her. She would lie awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying the events in her mind. The anger, the hurt, the sense of violation, they were emotions that could not be easily erased. But Vivian had learned to live with them, to let them fuel her determination to keep moving forward. She had survived the worst, and she would continue to survive no matter what challenges lay ahead. In the end, Vivian found a sense of closure not in the downfall of those who had wronged her, but in her own ability to rise above it. She had taken back her life, not through vengeance, but through transformation. Jonathan and Rebecca were now just shadows of the past, their names fading from the public's memory. But Vivian's legacy was one of strength and justice, a testament to the power of resilience. She had reclaimed her identity, not as a victim, but as a survivor, a woman who had turned her suffering into a force for good. As she stood on the balcony of her new home, overlooking the city that had once been her kingdom, Vivian felt a sense of peace. The journey had been long and painful, but it had led her to a place of strength and purpose. She had faced her worst fears, confronted those who had betrayed her, and emerged victorious. But more importantly, she had found a new path, one that was guided not by the desire for revenge, but by the pursuit of justice and healing. Vivian Anderson was no longer just a survivor. She was a woman reborn, ready to face whatever the future held. The morning sun cast a golden glow over the city as Vivian stood by the window of her new home, gazing out at the horizon. It had been a long and arduous journey, one that had tested every fiber of her being. But she had emerged on the other side stronger and more resilient than she ever thought possible. The woman who had once been betrayed and left for dead was gone, replaced by someone who had found a new purpose in life. Vivian Anderson was no longer defined by her wealth or her status, but by the strength she had discovered within herself. She had been reborn, and with that rebirth came a sense of peace she had never known before. In the quiet moments of reflection, Vivian thought about the path that had led her here. The accident, the betrayal, the months of isolation on the island. It all seemed like a distant nightmare, a chapter from a life that no longer belonged to her. Yet, without those experiences, she wouldn't have become the person she was today. The pain and suffering had forged her into someone who could not only survive, but thrive. She had learned that true strength wasn't about power or control, but about resilience, about the ability to rise after being knocked down. It was a lesson that had come at a great cost, but it was one she would carry with her for the rest of her life. Vivian's journey of rebirth wasn't just about healing from the past. It was about finding a new purpose. She had realized that her old life, filled with luxury and status, had been empty in many ways. The betrayal had opened her eyes to the superficiality of the world she had once inhabited. Now, she was driven by a desire to make a difference, to use her experiences to help others who had suffered as she had. Her wealth, once a symbol of her success, became a tool for change. She invested in charities, funded shelters for victims of abuse, and provided legal aid for those who had been wronged. Each act of kindness, each life she touched, was a step toward redemption. But redemption, Vivian knew, wasn't just about what she did for others. It was also about forgiving herself. There were moments, especially in the dead of night, when the memories of Jonathan and Rebecca's betrayal would resurface, bringing with them a wave of anger and regret. She had trusted them, loved them, and they had used that trust to try to destroy her. It was a wound that would never fully heal, but she had come to understand that holding on to that pain would only keep her chained to the past. Forgiving them was impossible, but forgiving herself for being vulnerable, for being human, was necessary. It was the only way to truly move forward. Vivian's transformation was not something she had planned or anticipated. It was something that had emerged from the crucible of her experiences. She had been forced to confront the darkest parts of herself, to face the fear and the anger that had consumed her. But through that process, she had found a new sense of clarity, a new understanding of who she was and what she wanted from life. She no longer needed the approval or admiration of others. She had found a sense of worth within herself. Vivian Anderson had been reborn, not as a victim of circumstance, but as a woman who had taken control of her own destiny. As she continued to build her new life, Vivian was constantly reminded of the people who had supported her along the way. The lawyer who had believed in her when no one else did. The fisherman who had shown her kindness when she was at her lowest. These were the people who had helped her find her way back. She was no longer surrounded by sycophants and fair-weather friends. Instead, she had built a network of genuine connections, people who valued her for who she was, not what she had. This, more than anything, was the true reward of her journey. She had found a community, a sense of belonging that she had never known before. Looking toward the future, Vivian felt a sense of hope that had once seemed impossible. She had faced the worst that life could throw at her and had come out the other side stronger, wiser, and more determined than ever. The road ahead was still uncertain, but she was no longer afraid. She had learned to trust herself, to rely on the inner strength that had carried her through the darkest of times. Whatever challenges lay ahead, she knew she could face them. Vivian Anderson was not just a survivor. She was a warrior, and she was ready to embrace whatever the future held. As the sun set on the horizon, Vivian felt a sense of closure that she had longed for, but never thought she would achieve. She had found redemption, not in the downfall of those who had wronged her, but in her ability to rise above it. The life she had now was different from the one she had lost, but it was richer, more meaningful, and filled with a sense of purpose that she had never known before. Vivian Anderson had been reborn, and in her rebirth, she had found the strength to forgive herself, to embrace her new life, and to look toward the future with hope and determination. With a final deep breath, Vivian stepped away from the window and walked toward the door. She had spent enough time looking back. Now, it was time to move forward, to continue building the life she had reclaimed. As she opened the door, she was greeted by the warm, familiar faces of the people who had become her new family, her new community. Together, they would face whatever came next, knowing that they had each other to rely on. Vivian smiled, feeling a sense of peace and fulfillment that she had never thought possible. She was ready for whatever the future held, and for the first time in a long time, she felt truly alive. Vivian's journey from betrayal to rebirth is a powerful reminder of the strength that lies within us all. If you were moved by her story, I invite you to continue exploring the stories of resilience and transformation that follow. Please subscribe to the channel, activate notifications, and leave a comment sharing your thoughts on Vivian's incredible journey. And if you'd like to support more stories like this, consider contributing through the Buy Me a Coffee link in the pinned comment. Thank you for being part of this journey. Together, we can continue to find strength in the face of adversity.